This is Ed Weiser, and this is the December episode of Dr. Fish with Bobby Miller. And today we're going to be talking about the tank transfer method of treating fish for diseases. So, Bobby, would you want to start out? Tell us what's going on.
Yeah, I've got here, turn it, and I'll actually kind of stand up next to it. This is just a 10-gallon aquarium that I use for tank transfer method. Okay, see it okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
So it's a 10-gallon aquarium that I use for tank transfer method, and I keep it pretty simple. As you can see, you have a heater here. You have your thermometer. You've got, for a hiding spot, you've got your PVC elbow. And I just use like a good old-fashioned air stone, which you can see right here, to provide oxygenation. And what I do, a lot of people I've noticed they don't use, and you probably know this from days of freshwater, is to use a gang valve. If I can kind of get this off a little bit. Well, anyway, actually, let me see if I can kind of, this might actually work a little bit better if you can see like the top of it.
Right.
The gang valve, you can plug the airline tubing into it, and then from there, the gang valve, you can plug it into the air pump. And I like the gang valve because if the airline becomes dislodged, you're not going to have water siphoning out of the tank. It's like a safety measure. You know, if this actually comes undone, it just falls right back into the tank. So, because I helped a guy recently who actually did this, and he actually had the airline hose hanging outside the tank, siphoned water went everywhere. Of course, this happened when he wasn't home. So the way tank transfer works, you set up a simple aquarium like this. You need to have two of them. So you have to have a duplicate. So everything you see here, you have to have another one all exactly the same. You leave the fish in this for 72 hours or less, and then you transfer the fish to another tank. And this aquarium here, you have to, as soon as you do the transfer, you have to immediately sterilize it. You can use vinegar to clean everything, and then you have to dry it thoroughly for 72 hours, or you can use bleach to sterilize everything, and then you have to let it dry for 72 hours. So what you're doing with this method, you can only use this method for ick, but what it does is you're outrunning the parasite's known life cycle. Because in every study that's ever been done on ick, the trophont can only remain on the fish for 3 to 7 days. So by transferring the fish into a different aquarium every 3 days, at some point in the process, you're going to outrun the parasite's known life cycle. So you're going to like leave ick behind in one of these tanks as you do the transfers.
So you want to go, you would want to switch before the 72 days comes up. Is that your idea of
72 hours?
72 hours. Every 72 hours, excuse me. So every 72 hours, you want to switch it out.
Yeah, it's 72 hours or less. You can do a little bit less, so 70, 71 hours, but you never want to exceed 72 hours. If you exceed 72 hours for some reason, you have to start the process all over again from day one. You do the 72 hours, you transfer the fish. And it doesn't, it used to be we believe that you had to do the transfer first thing in the morning. More research has been done, and it doesn't matter any time of day. So if you want to do the transfer first thing in the morning, if that suits your schedule, that's fine. If it's better to do it at night or in the middle of the day, but just if you're going to do it, let's just say it's 7 o'clock, then 72 hours later, before 7 o'clock, you have to do it again. So you have to kind of stay on top of it. You can't procrastinate. And you just, as long as you keep to a schedule, then you'll eradicate ick from your fish.
I know one thing that I had done in this particular process is maybe like on your heaters and everything that you have on that one setup, maybe mark them with some like a piece of paint or something on each one of the parts on the cords, so that you can keep track of don't get them mixed up and that kind of thing. I always try to keep things together. That's a good way of doing it. You can just mark them with a paint brush on the cord itself that goes with this setup kind of thing.
Exactly. And you have to, I stress to people, as soon as you've transferred the fish, you immediately then have to either clean with vinegar or sterilize with bleach, because you want that 3-day drying time. Because if you use vinegar, the drying time is the sterilization process. If you use bleach, obviously you want to rinse thoroughly, but then that 3 days allows any residue to evaporate as well. So that's really, really important. So I tell a lot of people, like to do it, like first thing in the morning. So it's like a day when you have to do tank transfer, just wake up an hour early before going to work, so you can kind of allow an hour to do what needs to be done so that, you get it done.
Do you use any particular medicines in the tank transfer, or you just wanted to keep it straight to the tank transfer, taking care of all the problems?
Well, so one of the nice things about tank transfer, because there's no chemicals in the water, you can use Prime or Amquel or another ammonia reducer. So, you can't ever use this with copper in the water, but during tank transfer, you typically won't see ammonia in just 3 days. But if you do, you can always dose a little Prime to remove any ammonia, to neutralize it. I personally like to use ProziPro in conjunction with tank transfer method. So tank transfer is a total of 5 transfers. Okay, so and by that I mean when you first put the fish in the tank for the first day 1, that's your first transfer. So you have 5 transfers total to complete tank transfer method. On transfers 2 and 4, so that would be day 4 and day 8, if I'm doing that correctly, you would dose ProziPro at the onset of tank transfer method. And what this does is it deworms the fish. So you're able to combine a treatment for ick with also a deworming process to eradicate gill flukes. So by doing that, so what you have after 13 days, you have a fish that is completely ick-free, is worm-free. So then you would just want to observe for maybe another 2 weeks to be sure something like velvet, brook, or a bacterial infection, which all of those show obvious symptoms, don't arise.
Right. So that would be the completed, say, in what, 13 weeks you said would be the completed stage to do a complete QT on a fish.
13 days.
13.
Yep. 13.
But, I mean, you was talking about a long time. So is there any other thing that you would recommend to do in this situation?
I mean, really, that's the beauty of this, is it's so simple to do. If you do this and you combine it with ProziPro, I mean, so ick and flukes are the 2 diseases which can kind of harbor inside a fish's gills out of sight. By using this method, combining it with ProziPro, what you've done, you're going to have the 2 hidden diseases. They've been treated prophylactically. So then the only thing you're left to do is just, and all these other diseases are going to have obvious symptoms, physical symptoms on the skin. So you're just then in a 2-week countdown after the final transfer to watch for any other diseases. I do have one other little tips, things I do. So for example, I use air stones. I use coarse air stones because I really hate little micro bubbles all in the water. So then by using coarse air stones, that kind of, alleviates that. The other thing I really like to do, and when I transfer the fish, instead of using a net, I use a colander.
Right.
So you drain the water a little bit, and then you're actually able to use a colander to catch the fish instead of a net, so you don't get, their fins and spines and everything caught in the net. And another little trick is it's easier to use a square colander than a round one, because the aquarium corners are square. So it just makes it easier to catch the fish. You want to transfer as little water as possible with the fish before placing the fish in the next aquarium, the next tank transfer tank. And you can use, I just grabbed a couple of these. I mean, you can get PVC elbows in a lot of shapes and sizes. The one I've gotten here is more for a smaller fish. This would be for a medium. If you're quarantining a larger fish, like an angel or a tang, you could use something like this. And you can get these at any hardware store, Home Depot, Lowe's, they all sell them. Another thing people like to do with tank transfer method is, especially if they're going to quarantine smaller fish, you can just use a 5-gallon bucket. I wouldn't recommend that on angels or tangs or anything like that. If you're just going to quarantine some firefish or whatnot, You can just use you can just take all this equipment, put it in a 5-gallon bucket, and then use a couple of 5-gallon buckets to do the transfer. The other thing you want to do if you're going to be quarantining fish that jump is you want to use, I just use an egg crate screen to, to keep them in. You can also use like some fine mesh material like this. If you have a fish, like a firefish would just jump right through this. But if you use, if you sew this into the egg crate using like fishing line, you've got a do-it-yourself cheap top so the fish can't jump out. Of course, you need 2 of these, for 2 tank transfer tanks.
Do you worry about having a light on the tank, or keeping any kind of lighting schedule going with the fish?
I don't ever put a light when doing tank transfer. If you put it in a room, just say with a lamp that's not too far away, that kind of gives them ample lighting. Or if it's sort of like, you can even do tank transfer near a window so that you have natural light coming in. I mean, they're mostly going to rest the whole time that they're in here. You just want to provide some lighting for feeding, which feeding, I try to keep feeding down to once a day when I'm doing tank transfer method because, for ammonia. But I understand if you're going to quarantine like an anthias or a species that has a high metabolism, you might want to feed more than that. But then what I do to remove the waste, you can just use some airline tubing to suck it out, or just like a brine shrimp net that has fine mesh to scoop out any excess food.
Do you think it'd be wise, like you were talking about transferring the fish, would be wise maybe to have some extra salt water that you could just pour over the fish while it's in the colander to wash out any of the water from the previous tank before you put fish in the new tank?
You could do that. I mean, I've never done that. I've always, because the thing is, being that you're doing 5 transfers, it kind of builds in like a safety net. So just in case, like a little bit of the free swimmers, the therons did transfer with the fish over to the next transfer, technically 2 or 3 transfers should technically get the job done, but we do 5 because that's a little bit of a safety net. You could pour a little bit of water over the fish to kind of wash away any free swimmers, but I don't know, the fish might not like that.
It was just a thought. I was just thinking when you were talking about trying to keep the water down from coming from one tank to the next, that, well, maybe we could take the colander over a bucket and just pour a little water over it, and that would help that situation.
You could do to save money. One of the downsides to this method is, I mean, when I do tank transfers, so you have 5 transfers, so you're going, so in a 10-gallon aquarium, you're going through 50 gallons of water. Well, salt's not cheap. But what you can do is, if you have your display tank, if you're sure that your display tank is disease-free, you can actually use water from, like, you can store water from a recent water change, and you can use that water to do tank transfer method. You just don't want to ever siphon off the bottom. If you're just siphoning clean water out of your DT and you can store it, there's no reason why you can't use that water to do tank transfer method. So then you're like recycling your DT water, and you're saving on salt by doing it.
Right. I know a lot of people do that with their tank to also gets the fish used to the display tank water parameters that they'll be going into in the future.
Exactly. And what I do is, on the final, you have the final transfer, then you have a 2-week observation period post-tank transfer. You just make sure that the temperature and the salinity match your DT perfectly, and then you can then just take a net or that colander, transfer the fish into your DT, and it's good to go. I've probably quarantined, I can't say how many fish using this method. Never had a problem, never had ick, never had flukes. It's worked every single time.
Cured a lot of different diseases easily, because a lot of times if you use a lot of medicines, you can have a suppression of feeding with a lot of medicines, and can cause a lot of problems in that area.
Exactly. So that's, and a lot of people have an aversion to using copper and chemicals on fish. I can't say I blame them for the reasons, one of the reasons you said, appetite suppression. Well, this, other than if you opt to use ProziPro, like hyposalinity, is a chemical-free solution to treating ick.
Correct. Is there any problem that you would think of that could? Is there any fish that would have a problem with the tank transfer method that you found to be more delicate to this particular way of handling fish?
I would say large fish. So, for folks who have, really large aquariums and they're quarantining, like show size angelfish tangs, obviously a 10-gallon tank isn't going to cut it. So you might need to do like even a 20, 30-gallon. I know some people that have used like, like tubs to do tank transfer method, if they're doing like a lot of fish at one time. So may not be the best option if you're dealing with show size fish due to the size limitations. But I mean, I've actually, in just a 10-gallon, I've actually done tank transfer method. I can remember one time on a 6-inch fox face, and I didn't have any problems with just a 10-gallon. And I remember another time doing it on a 2 dwarf angels, and I think I had a third fish in as well. So I mean, the main thing is if you're gonna use tank transfer on more than one fish, you want to have more than one your PVC caves, so there's no territorial aggression between them, and you just want to keep a close eye on that ammonia. You can use an ammonia alert badge if you choose when doing tank transfer method, but once again, you have to have two, and they have to be cleaned in between each transfer.
I have a friend that this past Magna, he bought one of those Sena monitors, and that's what he uses in his tank transfer method tanks. He puts that and has a ammonia monitor on it.
Okay. Yeah, that would definitely work. Definitely.
It really made a difference. He said, "Oh, this is really nice because I can see when I have to do a water change or whatever, or when I'm doing my transfer, if it's getting close." That's what he found out. So, but it's a $200 piece, but somebody you can use it. This is a friend of mine's got, he likes a lot of gadgets. So.
Oh yeah, yeah. I try to keep it just simple, cheap. That's one of the reasons I like doing this, and I like even doing it using DT water is because it's other than my time, it doesn't cost anything.
Right. It's just like with most of the quarantine methods, everybody's got to figure out where can they put this extra aquarium in their house. Because they got a display tank, and their wife might not like having all these other aquariums in the house, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, this you can just store in your garage, or something, and it's kind of out of sight, out of mind, and you only need to set it up when you're quarantining fish. So it's not like you have to have a. I mean, honestly, sometimes I'll actually just do this on my kitchen countertop. Wife's not too enthused about that, but it's just like a quick, easy way of quarantining fish.
Well, it's always good to have extra tanks when you have an aquarium, because you never know when you might have some kind of other problem go on, like a cracked tank or something. You need to transfer fish out of there into buckets or whatever, So
Right.
It's always good to have a quarantine system for not only fish health, but also for just total tank health. You might have to use it for other things too, say coral issues.
You never know when a fish fight is going to break out or something's going to go wrong in your DT. I mean, you can get a toxin in the water, and it's like you've got to get everything out of there as fast as possible. So
always keep an eye out on when you have those $10 a gallon or $1 a gallon sales in it for do those and pick up a couple tanks.
Yes. Oh, the other thing, if you're gonna, some people, what I do is when I do tank transfer method, I will just literally like break down this tank and then set up another tank. Some people choose, they've got one tank in one room, one tank in the other. If you're going to do that, I just remind people to observe the 10-foot rule for aerosol transmission. So if you're going to, this applies to any aquarium really, but you want to make sure that both of your tank transfer tanks are 10 feet away from one another if you're going to have them set up simultaneously. And
Right.
Also 10 feet away from your display tank as well.
Right. You can get all your tanks sick at one time if you have a lot of tanks in one area or another. And so just the water dripping down, it's going to happen some way or another.
Yeah, especially because if you're using an air stone, you've got all the bubbles dispersing, so that's just more of an opportunity for therons to transfer via aerosol.
Do you try to keep your air real low? You don't want to go too fast, I don't think, do you?
Honestly, I crank it all the way. If I notice it's a fish, well, it kind of depends on the bio load too. If I'm just quarantining, say, a trio of firefish, and I'll the air pump, I'll turn it low. But if I'm quarantining tank transfer on a lot of fish, or like a large fish, like a large tang, those tangs need a lot of gas exchange. Oh yeah, I crank it all the way up, and they sometimes don't like it, but then if you can kind of put the PVC cave position, that they'll kind of go in that, and just to get away from the flow. And I tell people all the time, I mean, quarantine is stressful. Fish do get stressed out in quarantine, but just like with humans, fish don't die from stress. They die primarily from disease.
Right. And have you ever used any of that medicated foods, like the new era as a medicated food for fish? Do you ever use any medicated foods in this situation with a tank transfer method?
No, I just feed, depending on what the fish is eating. I try to feed flake or pellets because, it's just cleaner to feed that. But then, of course, sometimes, to entice the fish to eat, you have to feed frozen food, or even like live food sometimes, depending on the species. The medicated foods, I know, for example, there's one that actually it has CP, chloroquine phosphate, actually soaked into the food, and I know that's kind of like the new thing. But I don't understand how that works, because the disease is like ick, for example, will say it's more off the fish than on the fish. It only stays on the fish for 3 to 7 days, and then the rest of the time, its life cycle, which on average is 2 weeks, it's actually off the fish. So you're treating the fish, and it might build up the fish's immunity a little bit to the parasite, but being the parasite is still in the aquarium, it's just gonna come back, which is another reason why I like tank transfer, because you're moving the fish every 3 days. So eventually, at some point, the free swimmers are going to drop off and cysts form tomones. Well, when you move that fish, you're going to leave the tomones behind in the tank transfer tank, and that fish is going to be disease free in the new tank.
So after we get to this phase, we're okay to put the fish in the tank. We're happy. We feel like it's going to be just fine.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I would recommend just after the final transfer, which would be on day 13, just to quarantine for 2 more weeks. And then, just to observe, just passively observe for 2 weeks. Be sure, because I have seen a few instances where both brook and velvet can take up to 4 weeks to manifest symptoms. So, and being that this only treats ick, it doesn't treat brook or velvet, you kind of want to give another 2 weeks post tank transfer, just as an observational period, just to be absolutely sure. So, I mean, by using this and then putting the fish in a more permanent, or you can just keep them after the final transfer in this if you wish, you're basically quarantining a fish in like roughly 30 days.
Right. And then usually 30 days is a good round number to worry about fish and health and such. And so it works just fine that way, I think. Just stay for 30 days and just don't buy another fish for 30 days.
Exactly.
I'd always tell people, take it slow. A lot of times people will get so wound up and want to buy all these fish all at one time. It's best to try to do it one at a time, so you don't get the new fish sick, get the other fish sick, and you just got this big vicious cycle you get going on over time.
Well, and everybody seems like, and it's not just with fish, but with corals, everybody wants to reach the finish line. Well, you and I both know there's no finish line, because you might get to where you've got your core group of corals fish, but you're always kind of itching to add something else, or you might, trade a fish or a coral for another fish. So, I mean, I found it just never ends. I mean, you never get to the actual finish line where you've got everything completely stocked and you just don't add anything more to the tank, because at that point you just get bored with it.
Right. That's when you start a new tank.
Exactly. Oh, yeah, you can start it.
You just say, well, I'm just going to get a bigger tank now. But yeah, it's one thing my wife drives me crazy is she wants to keep adding fish all the time or whatever. And I tell her, well, we have enough fish in the tank right now. I've got, right now I've got 4 fish in my tank. It's 45 gallon, but that's to me, that's enough fish in the tank right now at the present moment in time. And she'll always want to add more fish, and you can't maybe one smaller fish I can get in there, you know.
Yeah.
And it's always best to if you want to get another fish, maybe trade those fish into the pet store, and we'll take them because they've been in your tank for a long time, and maybe somebody else want to buy them real fast, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Don't get so excited about buying new fish all the time.
Yeah, and that's how I think how people get in trouble because, you know, especially if they're new, they run out to buy a bunch of fish, they don't quarantine. And you can get away with that for a while, but you know, law of averages say that eventually you're gonna buy a fish that's gonna, you know, introduce a disease into your aquarium, and then it becomes a nightmare. You know, you have to go fallow and you have to treat to get it out. And then sometimes you're trying to figure out what disease it is because, you know, sometimes, you know, velvet initially looks like ick, but then turns out to be velvet and requires a different treatment.
And then you're getting in all kinds of trouble with you can't treat your display tank because you got corals and inverts, and this gets to be a big mess. So
it probably is the leading cause of people walking away from the hobby. You know, is when they for a wipeout, they just emotionally they're devastated. I mean, they've lost sometimes thousands of dollars depending on, you know, how big the tank is and what kind of livestock they have, you know, fish they have stocked. And it's just like they just wash their hands of it and walk away because they just can't deal with it anymore.
Right. It's a vicious cycle people get into with the hobbies about getting fish and throwing them in the tank, and then the disease starts and it kills everything.
Exactly.
So that's why we wanted to have this episode about the tank transfer message today, and hope everybody has a Merry Christmas, and also wanted to mention the Reef to Reef fund drive for the children's toys, and if you make sure you get that link and donate some money for kids for Christmas. And we want to thank Bobby for having us, and see you guys later. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Merry Christmas.